There's a version of America that never made it onto any map. Not because it was too small to notice, but because it chose not to be found. Deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, past the point where asphalt turns to gravel and gravel turns to mud, there are communities that have been governing themselves for generations, not with written constitutions, not with elected officials, with something older than that, with custom, with memory, with the kind of rule that gets passed from a grandmother's mouth directly into a child's understanding of the world. This video is not about poverty. It is not about backwardness. It is about what happens to human civilization when it has to build itself from scratch, with no outside authority to borrow from, no textbook to follow, no referee to call when things go wrong. And what you're going to find, as we go deeper into this list, is something uncomfortable. These communities didn't build something alien, they built something that looks a lot like us. Just without the decorations we use to pretend the rules came from somewhere legitimate. 12 communities, 12 systems, 12 mirrors. Start with something that sounds almost reasonable. In a still county, there are stretches of river where the question of who gets to fish, where has never been answered by any court, any license, any government office. It's answered by memory, by the understanding that the Combs family has worked the Eastern Bend since before anyone currently living was born, that the Napier side starts where the old sycamore fell, that if you don't know this and you wade into the wrong stretch, you're not breaking a law, you're breaking something older than law, and people here will tell you that's worse. These arrangements were never written down, because writing them down would mean acknowledging that the county government had no say in the matter. Which it didn't. The land was settled, divided, and understood long before any regulatory body arrived with clipboards and intentions. What's striking is how well it works. Generations of shared river use with almost no serious conflict, not because people are particularly noble, but because the rules are clear and everyone already knows them. You learn them the same way you learn which berries are poisonous, before you need to. There's something almost elegant about it, and there's something worth sitting with. This idea that a system of rules can function perfectly well without any institution behind it. All it needs is shared memory and the will to keep passing it on. The elegance won't last as we go deeper into this list. But here, at the beginning, let yourself find it. Linguists started visiting Fonda in the 1970s and came back confused. The English spoken there, the actual phonology, the grammar, certain vocabulary, was classified as closer to Elizabethan English than to any American dialect currently spoken in the country. Words that disappeared from the broader language centuries ago had simply kept living here, protected by the mountains the same way rare plants get protected by altitude. Nobody preserved it deliberately. It just never had reason to change. But the language was only the surface. What really drew researchers back was the hospitality code. In Fonda, a stranger arriving at your door is not an intrusion. They are a responsibility. The rules of how you receive someone, feed them, offer them shelter, and eventually send them on their way follow a structure so consistent across households that it reads less like custom and more like choreography. Visitors have described being guided through a social ritual they didn't understand but couldn't violate, because every next step was suggested to them before they knew they needed to take it. It's medieval in structure, not primitive, medieval, meaning it comes from a time when hospitality was a survival mechanism, when travelers needed houses, and houses needed the goodwill that came from being known as generous. The rules here weren't built for a romantic idea of community. They were built because isolation creates dependency, and dependency creates protocol. The language will probably be gone within a generation. The children are online now. The vocabulary is already bleeding away. What happens to the hospitality code when the language that carried it disappears? That question nobody has answered yet. Free Hill was founded before the Civil War. That's the first thing to understand. In the 1830s, a small group of free black men, legally free in a slaveholding state, acquired land in Clay County, Tennessee, and built a community on a hill. They called it Free Hill. and then they stayed. Through the war, through Reconstruction, through the decades of economic collapse that hollowed out most of rural Appalachia, they stayed. The population today is still largely descended from those original families. What developed over nearly 2 centuries of continuous settlement is a system of community leadership that traces itself through bloodlines, not in the feudal sense of hereditary power, but in the sense that knowing who someone's people are tells you what responsibilities they carry and what respect they're owed. It's not a democracy, and it's not a monarchy. It's something closer to a council of inherited trust. The history of why Freehill exists at all is inseparable from the rules it built. This community had to create its own internal order because external order was never designed to protect them. The courthouse wasn't theirs. The sheriff wasn't theirs. So they made something that was, and it held. For nearly 200 years it held. When you look at Freehill, you're not looking at a curiosity. You're looking at what people build when they understand, in their bones, that no one is coming to protect them. You build something that doesn't need them to. The road into Brasstown ends. Not gradually, it ends. One moment you're on a gravel track and then there are trees, and that's it. The community inside is accessible by foot or by the occasional ATV trail, and that's been true for most of its history. What that physical fact produced, over generations, is a decision-making structure that would look familiar to a student of ancient Athenian democracy and completely alien to anyone who's attended a modern city council meeting. Major decisions, where a new structure gets built, how a shared resource gets managed, what happens when 2 families have a dispute that affects the whole community, are resolved in weekly assemblies of adults. Not elected adults, not adults who campaigned for the right to speak, all of them. The assembly has no formal rules of procedure, but it runs with a consistency that suggests the informal rules are more deeply embedded than any formal ones could be. What's interesting is what happens when someone is new. Integration is slow. You don't arrive and immediately have a voice. You watch, you learn. You contribute labor before you contribute opinion. There's a period of observation that functions like an apprenticeship in belonging. Only after that period, measured not in months but in demonstrated understanding, do you start to be consulted. It sounds exhausting. It probably is. But the decisions that come out of that process tend to last, because everyone who will live with the outcome was part of making it. That's not a small thing. Calhoun County has fewer than 7,000 people. It also has, per capita, one of the longest-running systems of informal conflict resolution in the country, a tradition of settling serious disputes between families without courts, without lawyers, and without paper. The system isn't quaint. It emerged from necessity, from communities where the nearest courthouse was a day's travel away, and where involving external authorities in a local matter was considered a form of betrayal. You handled things internally, or you didn't handle them at all. The last documented blood feud in the county was considered resolved in 2003. Considered because in a system with no formal records, resolution is itself an informal thing. There was no signed agreement. There was a meeting. There were witnesses. There was an understanding reached. And since then, the understanding has held. Outsiders tend to look at this and see lawlessness. What they're actually seeing is a different kind of law, one that runs on reputation, on consequence, and on the understanding that in a community this small, you will be living next to the person you wronged for the rest of your life. That proximity is its own enforcement mechanism. It doesn't always work, but neither do courts. The coal companies left Harlan County decades ago. They took the equipment, the jobs, and most of the money. What they left behind was the infrastructure of a social order that had organized itself entirely around the mine. And here's what nobody talks about. The code didn't leave when the companies did. The rules that governed who owed what to whom, which families had standing to make claims on which land, who had the right to speak in a dispute, and who was expected to stay quiet, all of that persisted. Not as nostalgia, as active operating system. Families in the interior of Harlan County still navigate land disputes according to a logic derived from mining-era agreements that were never written down. Older residents can trace the origin of a current boundary disagreement back to a decision made by a foreman in 1937. This is what happens when an entire community's legal and social structure gets built around a single industry, and then that industry walks away without dissolving the structure it created. The scaffolding stays, and people keep living inside it, making it work, long after the building it was built around has gone. There's something almost haunting about it. A code designed to serve a machine that no longer exists, still running, still governing lives, because nobody has offered anything to replace it. The German Baptist Brethren, known locally as Dunkers, have been in the Appalachian region since the 18th century. Some of their communities in the mountain interior maintained prohibitions on electricity, photography, and any formal interaction with government institutions well into the 1990s. This is not the same as the Amish, though the comparison gets made. The Dunker position was more specific. It wasn't about technology in general. It was about the state, about the belief that binding yourself to any civic structure, any structure that claimed authority over your soul or your community, was a form of spiritual compromise that couldn't be walked back. The result was a community that functioned, economically and socially, entirely off the grid, not as a lifestyle choice, as a theological position. Children were born without birth certificates. Marriages were performed without county records. Deaths were mourned and buried without any involvement from institutions that didn't share the community's framework of the sacred. What makes this case worth sitting with is the question it raises about legitimacy. The county government would say these people were operating outside the law. The community would say the county government had no legitimate claim over them to begin with. Both positions are internally consistent. Neither has a clean answer to the other. The communities that maintained full separation are mostly gone now or much smaller. But the question they were living didn't disappear with them. In Lost Creek, a stranger who wants to stay more than one night needs to be introduced. Not welcomed, introduced. There's a difference. A welcome is social. An introduction in this context is structural. Someone who already belongs to the community has to stand up and account for you, has to say, in front of whoever is listening, this person is known to me. I am responsible for what they do here. It sounds medieval because it is. The logic of the voucher system in Lost Creek is exactly the same logic that governed entry into walled towns in the 14th century. You are not known, so you must be known by association. Someone must put their name on you. What's remarkable is that this isn't enforced by any authority. There's no town council that checks credentials. The enforcement is social, which, in a community this size, means total. If you arrive without introduction and stay without welcome, you will feel the edges of that fact in every interaction. Not hostility, necessarily. Just the persistent, quiet signal that you are outside the understood order of things. And if you stay long enough without correcting that, without finding someone to vouch, without earning your place, the community simply becomes slowly, completely unavailable to you. Every door slightly more closed than the last. It's the most elegant kind of boundary. Nobody draws it. Everyone maintains it. There's a valley in the interior of West Virginia, called Robber's Roost by people outside it, never by the people inside, that has been shared by two families who hate each other for the better part of a century. The details of the original conflict are now almost irrelievably tangled. Versions differ across family lines. What matters is what replaced the conflict: a code, an oral truce established roughly 80 years ago that divides the valley into territories with the precision of a treaty. Except no treaty was ever signed, because signing anything would mean admitting that the other family had legitimate standing to negotiate. So instead the code lives in memory, in the understanding of where you don't go, in the rituals of non-encounter that allowed two families who would prefer not to share a planet, to share a valley without anyone getting killed. Children grow up learning the map before they learn to read, not as a burden, as geography. just the shape of the world as it is. What keeps it working isn't affection, it's exhaustion and calculation. Both families have done the math enough times to understand that escalation costs more than coexistence. The valley is productive. Life is livable. The alternative, the thing that happened to other families in other valleys before codes like this one got made, wasn't worth it. The truce has held through weddings, funerals, floods, and at least one catastrophic fire where members of both families worked side by side without speaking. The code is load-bearing, and everyone who lives inside it knows that. The Melungeons are one of the most studied and least understood groups in American history. They appear in the historical record in the late 18th century, described by white settlers as a people of ambiguous origin, dark-skinned, living in the mountain interior, claiming to be Portuguese or Turkish or sometimes simply refusing to claim anything at all. Modern genetic analysis suggests a mixture of European, Sub-Saharan African, and Native American ancestry, which means they were, in a society organized entirely around racial categorization, categorically impossible. What they built in response to that impossibility is what makes them relevant here. The Melungeon communities developed a social and legal identity that existed entirely outside the racial taxonomy of the surrounding culture. They couldn't be classified, so they refused classification. They created internal rules about marriage, about land, about community membership that were designed, explicitly, pragmatically, to make them ungovernable by the systems that surrounded them. Not rebellious. Ungovernable. There's a difference. The persecution was real. There are documented cases of Melungeon individuals being stripped of voting rights, land rights, and legal standing because they couldn't prove membership in the white racial category required by Virginia and Tennessee law. Their response was not to seek inclusion. It was to build something that didn't need inclusion to function. What survived? The identity, the community networks, the particular pride that comes from knowing your people built something the world tried to destroy, is still active. People still identify as Melungeon, still carry the understanding of what that identity was made for. You don't build a wall to keep people out unless you've already learned what they do when they get in. Neon was a coal town, past tense, but barely. The company that built Neon, built it, owned it, named it, policed it, left in stages through the 1970s and 80s. When the last operation closed, it didn't just take the jobs. It took the store, the housing authority, the company-run clinic, and the informal security apparatus that had, for better and worse, maintained order in the community for decades. What was left was a population with no economic base and no institutional structure to replace the one that had just walked out the door. What happened next is the part that gets studied. The men who had been miners, who had organized, who had gone on strike, who had bled for union rights in a county where that could get you killed, didn't leave. Some did. Most didn't. And the ones who stayed built something from the wreckage. A system of local accountability, organized around the old union structure that adjudicated disputes, distributed what resources existed, and maintained a code of conduct strict enough to function as governance without any official legitimacy behind it. It was rough. There were failures. There are still failures. But Neon did not collapse into the kind of spiral that destroyed comparable communities. And the reason, the structural reason, is that the people who stayed had already spent their lives inside an organization that taught them how to make collective decisions under pressure. The mind gave them the skills and then abandoned them. They used the skills anyway. That's not irony. That's survival. There is a community in West Virginia that refused a zip code. This isn't a rumor or a legend. It's a documented administrative fact. In the 1980s, when the Postal Service was standardizing addresses throughout the region, a community in the western part of the state formally declined to participate. No zip code was assigned. No street addresses were created. The community does not appear in the USPS database. Several of its older residents have no birth certificates on file with the state. Sociologists who have studied the community carefully over years, with the slow process of earned trust that this list has described several times now, describe it as the closest thing to a functioning micro-civilization that contemporary America contains. The rules here are not simple. They cover land use, resource distribution, conflict resolution, community membership, the raising of children, the treatment of the elderly, the management of shared infrastructure, and the question of what happens when someone wants to leave and come back. Every one of these systems has been refined across generations. Every one of them is oral. None of them require the outside world to function. What researchers found, and what makes this community the final point in this list rather than simply the most extreme, is that the rules aren't harsh. They're not isolationist in the paranoid sense. They're just complete. A complete system, running continuously, that has decided the world outside it has nothing to offer that justifies the cost of integration. That's not backwardness. That's a conclusion. A reasoned, tested, generationally confirmed conclusion that the exchange, our rules for yours, our structure for the one you bring, isn't worth making. And the hardest part about sitting with that conclusion is this. When you look at what those communities got in return for their integration, when you look at what the mines left behind, and what the government delivered, and what the market offered, you start to wonder whether their math is wrong. Every society builds rules. That's not the insight. The insight is simpler and harder. The rules always feel necessary to the people inside them, and arbitrary to everyone watching from outside. The Appalachian communities in this list didn't build something primitive. They built something human, which means they built hierarchies and protections and exclusions and loyalties, the same as every civilization that considers itself more advanced. The difference is just this. Their rules are visible. You can see the seams. You can watch the negotiation happening in real time, in a language old enough to carry the weight of every decision that came before it. Ours are invisible, which makes them easier to live inside and much harder to question. Somewhere right now, in a valley with no name, an old man is explaining to a child where the boundary runs and why it matters, and what happened the last time someone forgot. The child is listening. That's how it's always been done. Not just there, everywhere.